The two questions that I get asked the most are, do you see yourself living here for a while? And where do you see yourself living in 5 years? And when I say that these are the questions I get asked the most, these are the questions of my life. Normally they come in waves. I would say the waves come about every 2 years, but like I've been getting these questions for the past 15 years of my life. And, generally they come at a time when I'm feeling this like deep desire for more, and that desire is really loud. And I think in my brain, I immediately jump to, well, the only remedy is to move cities or to move physical locations. And so that's what I've really been feeling in the past like week and a half or so. And if you've been watching the past couple of episodes, you're probably really confused by me even saying that, because it's like, if you listen to me talking about how I manifested my current apartment, I'm like, everything is good. I love this place. This is perfect for right now. And, I think through the editing process, or just one of the most surprising things about podcasting for me has been how quickly I could move on to the next thing. So it's like the whole process of figuring out what stays and what goes in my life is just sped up, because in the editing process, I'm watching myself back. I'm listening to myself back over and over again every single week. And, so whether it's a situation, a mindset, a topic, a clothing item, like I'm just quickly identifying what is really making me bored. What am I excited about? What needs to go? And so that's really what has like caused these waves to come. And I think the more that I've gone after what I want, the more I'm like building up, my routine and my process around podcasting. I think energetically things are just moving in the universe. And so, as other people see this movement, that's when I start to get questions of like, do you see yourself living here for a while? And that question in and of itself is like sparking this urge to run for me. And, if I think about, in this restlessness that I feel around, when things aren't going well or the way I want them to go, that really applies to both career and relationships. So if I don't feel like certain aspects are going well, that's when in my brain, I think the only remedy is to move cities. And so that's really where this like urge to run is coming from. And then people asking me these questions of like, do you see yourself living here for a while? That absolutely does not help anything at all. And it actually makes my brain spiral a bit more. For you sitting there, I'm sure there's like a question that's at the top of your mind of like, whenever people ask you that question, it sort of sends you down a spiral of thought and of the what ifs and of the, oh, should I be doing this or should I be doing that? And maybe it is this question for you of like, do you see yourself living here for a while? Or maybe it's a completely different question, but I think all of us have that sort of question that could trigger a fight or flight response. And for me, this question of, do you see yourself living here for a while, or where do you see yourself living in 5 years? These are the types of questions that spark this fight or flight response. And for me, it's a flight response in the form of, let me just move cities. So today, what I want to do is really dissect this urge to run and ultimately land in a place where it's like, okay, I no longer feel this urge to run. And so let's get into it. When I think about where this urge to run comes from, I think it comes from this whole like mindset and way of life that I have around just like being independent. And, there's a light and a dark side to independence. It's like the light side of independence is I can go wherever I want. I could do whatever I want. I could build whatever I want. I could make the life that I want to live. And I can do it myself. I have all the resources I need. And if I don't have the resources, I have a way of getting them so that I can get myself to where I want to go. The dark side of independence is really just like, well, I'm going to discard what isn't working. I can leave chapters and people behind. And I don't necessarily need certain things. And maybe I'm even on an island by myself and I'm just going to handle everything myself. And so it doesn't leave space for connection, and it makes you feel a bit more disconnected. And, by leaving certain connections behind, it's bringing about separations, but also like in some cases you're abandoning others and even abandoning yourself. So, this urge to run gets super loud for me when it's almost like both the light side and the dark side of independence are really loud in my brain. It's like if those are two sides of myself, they're both screaming at each other inside my brain. And that's when I get down this spiral of like, what do I do next? And if I think about, where this whole desire for independence comes from, and this whole, like, it's in many ways, it's been a huge part of my identity. When I think about where that comes from, I think about my female family members, because independence is something that I think all the women in my family have really wanted. And, of course, everyone wants a certain level of independence, but it's interesting because there's a lot of females in my family who have had every intention of being independent, but there's certain things that get thrown in their path as blockers. Some of them have been able to maneuver around the blocks, but other people just get stuck at the blockage. And so, I think about, I was recently having a conversation with a couple female family members, one of which is my mom. And they were talking about how they had both been engaged previously to their long-standing partners and husbands. And, it came up because one of the guys that they had been engaged to died. And I was like, wait, who is this? It led us down this whole path. And what I found through that conversation is like these guys that they were once engaged to, they had no real connection to them, but they just felt like they had to say yes. They felt like they had to progress forward in their lives because the only path that was laid out for them was you grow up and you get married. It was never you grow up, you go to college, you get a job, you find what you're most passionate about, you find what fulfills you emotionally, you chase your dreams, you build stability, like none of that. And so as they were pushed to operate in this world of like, well, you must grow up and get married, they felt like the first guy that came along that showed interest in getting married, they felt like they had to say yes to. And that's even interesting from like the male's perspective, because like one of the guys that they were engaged to eventually became gay, like they were closeted all along, but they were also living in this societal expectation of like, you must grow up and you must get married to a member of the opposite sex, basically. And so, as we were talking about that, my first biggest question to them was like, well, how did you get out of it? Because I think, I've also like witnessed friends be in scenarios of this where it's like they're in an engagement and they're like, oh my God, I don't want to be in this anymore. So how do I get out of it? And I watched friends go through very painful decisions that have to be made around like whether or not they stay in a relationship that has gotten to a point of commitment where they're engaged. Back to the conversation with the female family members, I just have so much compassion, particularly, in thinking about these female family members, because if you're living in a time, and particularly in their generation, like growing up, if the only path that is placed in front of you is you grow up and get married, it would make sense that there would then become this sort of desperation around that, so that, whoever the first person is to come along to ask you to marry them, it would make sense that you would feel like you would have to say yes to the first person that asked, because if your only path is to grow up and get married, that's also implying the whole like you complete me narrative, and the fact that you have to find your other half or your better half. You're not complete on your own. And so when that's the expectation, it's essentially saying that you aren't good enough until you are whole, but you aren't whole on your own. So of course you're going to try and fill that gap as fast as possible. And so I have just so much compassion around like the fact that they were able to go against societal expectation, in the sense of like they were willing to say no, or they were willing to get themselves out of that situation because they knew it wasn't good. Even though in that moment they were going against societal expectations, they knew that there was a different path out there for them. And so I do have such a sense of awe for them and for anyone who makes that really difficult decision to, walk away from a life that was theoretically all planned out for you. And, I think that takes such an incredible amount of courage. And I'm also, I've just been so grateful to have those types of influences around me, because those people, like my mom and this other female family member, like they have a capacity to go against societal expectations. And that really becomes helpful when there are other influences in the family, where there's other female family members who, sure, I'm thinking of one person in particular where I know that they have gone against societal expectations here and there. They've dabbled in it throughout their lives, more so in their younger years. And I don't think it went well for them, in the sense of it didn't feel safe. So they stepped out against societal expectations and they're like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming. I have to go back into my box, sort of thing. And so because they went through such a painful sort of like stepping out of the box and then realizing that it wasn't safe, so they had to come back into the box of what society expects, where that becomes really tricky for me and many of us probably, if you're sitting here watching this, you probably have experienced some flavor of this, where it's like, because stepping outside of societal expectations has proved to them to be unsafe, they now expect everyone else to just follow societal expectations, because they're like, no, this is what's safe. So where that becomes really tricky for me is like, I have this other female family member who's like waltzing into my life in my late 20s and suddenly has all these opinions about my life, because she's looking at my life and she sees a gap that needs to be filled, a problem that needs to be solved in that. I'm not going I'm not going down the path that was laid out for generations before me. I'm not following the path of like you grow up and you get married. Like there's so much more nuance. It's like I've grown up, I've gone to college, I've gotten a job, I built my career, I've learned XYZ things about myself, I've found these passions, I've figured out how to fulfill myself emotionally, and I'm like on this healing journey and constantly learning new things about myself every single day. I'm chasing my dreams, I'm building a life for myself. It's like there's so much more nuance to that. But I have this female family member coming into my life, like in my late 20s, saying to my mom, she said this, we need to find Allie a boy in the church. Which is like crazy because, and you're probably sitting there, I would imagine you have versions of this in your life because I think it's just such a widespread thing. And it's like, it was so out of left field for her to even say that because like I'm not religious and I'm way more spiritual than I am religious. I've never gone to church. You know, I went to a Jesuit high school, but like I have a great deal of respect for religion, but I certainly am not religious at all. And so, but that's a great example of like this female family member who has once stepped out of societal expectations and is like, oh my God, I can't handle it. It makes sense that now she's like putting herself in this box of, you know, the church and there's only men at the church and, you know, Allie needs to find a boy in the church, you know, but what's fascinating, you know, just going deeper into that story of like, when this female family member came forward with this like insane realization that, oh, we need to find Allie a boy in the church, she was saying that to my mom. And I think what's interesting, I wasn't in that conversation, thank God. I probably would have gone off on her. But, you know, the interesting part about this is like how I found out about it was through my mom. And, you know, while society expects us to go out and find our better halves, my mom is whispering in my ear, telling me to go after my dreams. And so, you know, I've had this force behind me of like, go after what you want. And it's constantly butting up against these different societal expectations of like, you need to get married, you need to have a partner, you need to follow like, you know, you need to do more of this and less of that, and you can't be too much of this and not enough of that. It's like, it's just everyone wants something different from each of us. And you know, when I think about how I approach independence, a lot of it has been inspired by my mom just like pushing me and whispering in my ear constantly, like, go after your dreams. But at the same time, that has really only presented two different paths for me. And, you know, one of the paths, of course, is you grow up and you get married. Also known as you aren't complete on your own. You need to find your better half, your other half, in order to make yourself whole. Path number two is you grow up and you build your career, also known as you're independent. And so because those are the two paths that were initially laid out for me, I've been choosing number two all day, every day. I've really leaned into my independence to go after what I want. And, you know, what that has translated to, though, is like me moving physical locations. So I've moved to London, I moved to Chicago, I moved to Chicago again, I moved back to Indianapolis. And, you know, that has caused pain in my relationships. It's like really painful separations and goodbyes, and oftentimes like leaving people at a moment's notice. And so where the light and dark sides of independence come in here is like, on the light side of independence, there's sort of this detachment of like, I can go anywhere I want, do whatever I want. I can hustle, I could grind, I could build my career. But then there's this darker side of like, well, I can like leave close connections and I don't necessarily need to have them in my everyday life, and like things like that, where it's just like it's more of like the discarding of connections in order to go after what I want. And it's sort of like that saying of like, if you want to go fast, go alone. And, I think for the most part, I've really followed that part of the phrase. There's the ending of that phrase is like, if you want to go far, go together. But when I've really gone after this independence with brute force, I've only operated from this place of like, if you want to go fast, go alone. And so with this whole question of like, do you see yourself living here for a while? That's really coming from people who have been with me for over half my life. Like they've been with me through these eras of moving to London, moving to Chicago again, moving back to Indy. Like they know, and it's almost like I've planted this lingering concern in their brains of just like, I could leave again. I know that this is a lingering concern because it's like years later. I mean, like throughout the past decade or so, I've been at several events where people are asking me these questions. And it's like, this is the topic of the event. It's like, Allie, where are you going to be living in XYZ amount of time? And so that's how I know it's been this, I've created this lingering concern. And, I think in just thinking about the light side and the dark side of independence, it's like the light side is that I can lean into this element and this feeling of detachment where it's like, okay, I can go wherever I want. I can do whatever I want. But then there's this darker side of just like my close connections and people I love so dearly, like don't necessarily know when I'm going to leave again. And they just don't know if I'm going to abandon them. When I sit back and think about that, that's a really hard pill for me to swallow because I don't want the people closest to me to be worried about when I'm going to leave next. And I don't want that to be a lingering concern. I even have been asking myself, like, when I have followed independence with brute force and have gone after what I want, I've known that my body, I've learned that my body can't handle it. I mean, it's just like chronic pain, inflammation, food sensitivities, cystic acne. Like, my body just couldn't keep up with the lifestyle of being this hyper independent person. And, I've been asking myself if like, am I abandoning myself by doing this, by operating in this way? And so it's like, yes, I've blindsided others by me leaving and moving cities, but I've also blindsided myself just in the fact that like my body almost can't process that sort of like leaving and the shifting and going after things with brute force and going at it alone. Like it's just not sustainable for me. And I think through that process, I just become really disconnected with myself, disconnected with my body and disconnected from myself. And so, while moving physical locations has been such an adventure and so much fun in so many ways, and I'm so grateful for those experiences, I think I did learn a couple big things, which is one, your dreams can change. The dream I had initially of like moving to a big city, working in an advertising agency, like working on these super sexy clients in this sexy area and like the fast-paced lifestyle, that is no longer my dream because my body couldn't keep up with it. I physically was not okay, mentally, emotionally, not okay. So that was the first thing I learned. The second is moving isn't going to solve your problems. If you're moving locations and simultaneously not doing the subconscious reprogramming to reprogram your limiting beliefs that are running on a loop in your mind, that are creating the difficulties in your reality today, those difficulties aren't just going to go away if you move cities. Like, those difficulties will still be there because you aren't doing the subconscious reprogramming work. So the solution is not actually to move cities if you want to solve your problems. If you want to solve your problems, you need to do the subconscious reprogramming work. Now, you could still move cities, sure. But I think if I learned anything, it's that moving cities is only going to make your problems more pronounced simply because you're in a new location. Now, you might be wondering, like, okay, Allie, like, well, why is this such a groundbreaking thing? Like, of course, moving cities isn't going to solve your problems and that sort of thing. I've been asking myself that same question. That's very fair. Now, when I was around 0 to 2 years old, yes, we are going back that far. There's a period of time where I lived in Germany. So my dad took a short-term assignment in Germany. My mom and I went and lived over there for a period of time. And there was a point in which I was sent back to the United States. And I was sent back to the United States to live with my grandma. And that move came at a time when things weren't necessarily going well for me in Germany. And so because that was a very, very foundational experience, it's fascinating because that experience has informed some of the difficulties that I'm experiencing today. Because in that experience, you have, there's like a career related aspect to that. There's a close connections related aspect to that. There's a physical locations aspect to that. And so that's what my subconscious picked up. And that's kind of the loop that's running in my brain right now. And I'm working to kind of disassemble that belief and reprogram it to be a new belief. And I'm doing that through To Be Magnetic, the manifestation process, but it's also subconscious reprogramming. It's using neuroplasticity, psychology, epigenetics, energetics to like rewrite new neural pathways. And, I'm doing this through To Be Magnetic's pathway membership. And so if this is at all interesting to you and you're like, God, I have these difficulties in my life right now that I want to solve them, I would highly recommend joining To Be Magnetic. And I have a discount code for you if you're interested. It's 15% off your membership, the pathway membership. And now would actually be a great time to join because starting at the beginning of June, we're going into the summer challenge, which is all about like manifesting money and, how can you bring more money into your life? And so I'm super excited for that. So if you're at all interested in rewriting your subconscious and like taking the difficulties that you currently have and like getting rid of them, I'd highly recommend To Be Magnetic's membership. So this very foundational experience of like me needing to move physical locations because things weren't going well for me, it has created this really interesting cocktail of emotions that I have around physical location in relation to close connections. And, I've been trying to look at this through a fixed mindset versus growth mindset because I think this whole urge to run is inherently very fixed mindset in the sense of I need to discard what isn't working. It's more of like this all or nothing thing where it's like, oh, if that's not working, that needs to go. And it's generally this belief that like your problems are always going to be your problems. Now, if you reframe that into a growth mindset, it's more of, growth mindset is about how like recognizing that the difficulties that you're currently experiencing will not always be your difficulties. And it's also about like enjoying the process of living in the physical location that you're in. And it's, if something isn't going well or you feel like certain things can change here and there, it's recognizing that you can use your voice to create the change and you can start the conversations to fix it. And so, I've been thinking about this fixed mindset versus growth mindset a lot because I think in many areas of my life, I can toggle into the growth mindset and operate from there. But I think, because I have this foundational experience of like a very fixed mindset, like, well, this isn't working out here for you, so you have to run, or we're sending you on a run. That it's just left an interesting spider web of things for me to kind of work through. Diving deeper into the growth mindset, though, I think, just going back to the beginning of the story about how there were only two paths really laid out for me of like, you grow up and you get married. And the second path being you grow up and you build your career. I think with the growth mindset, that's giving yourself the options to create a third path, a fourth path, a fifth path, like figure out like you wouldn't look at the situation so black and white. You'd actually look to find the gray areas and find the gray areas that are specifically tailored to you and what feels best for you. And that's the part that can change over time. And so the growth mindset is also like allowing for change over time. And that's where the whole two questions of like, do you see yourself living here for a while? And where do you see yourself living in 5 years? That's where it gets really tricky to answer those questions, especially when, if I'm trying to adopt a growth mindset where it's like things can change at any point and you have to enjoy the process of the change that's unfolding. And so, I feel like in a lot of ways when those questions are asked, it's sort of boxing me in to a specific plan, and it's not leaving room for magic, for unexpected surprises, for the most unimaginable things in the best way. It's not leaving room for any of that. And so that's where I start to feel like I'm backed into a corner a little bit. And that's why I start to feel this urge to run, is because you aren't leaving room for change and growth and evolution. And, when I think about just wanting to get myself into this place of not wanting to run, I think it is really leaning into this growth mindset of how can I just enjoy the process and allow things to evolve, it's almost like as these waves are like crashing over me of like, I want to run, I want to run, I want to run. It's like, instead of getting on a surfboard and surfing the waves into the next city, what I really need to do is like sink down to the bottom of the ocean, hold my breath, wait peacefully for the waves to pass, and then come back up again and just like start swimming. It's also leaving room for close connections to feel safe and to come in and to be there. It's like, it's almost like having to become a pillar of strength in trying to prove to people that you aren't just going to run again. And that's a place that I'm really finding myself in right now. And, maybe you can relate. I know we all go through fight or flight responses, and this is just like my flight response. But I think it's been so helpful for me to recognize it, because if I can recognize it and remind myself that like, yeah, moving cities never solved my problems to begin with, it's not going to solve my problems now. It's okay to just sit back, sink down into a peaceful place and like do the work in order to create the change I want to see in my life. But I do think it's important to point out that like my independence is going to stay. What I want to get myself to is this place of more of like autonomy. So being able to be in close connection, but also having this sense of independence where it's like, yeah, I can, if I want something, I can go and do it. I can figure it out. But also being able to coexist within close connections. And so that's just like the big thing that I'm being asked to learn in this moment of time. Thank you so much for joining today. If you've found value in this episode, if you've enjoyed this episode, please follow, give a 5-star review. If as you've been listening to this episode, if there's like a friend in mind that you're like, God, this reminds me of you so much, please send them the episode. I would love to bring them in on the conversation. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. I will talk to you next week.